Saber and Shadow by S.M. Stirling and Shirley Meier. From Chapter 21. The place might have been a tenement or a mansion 4 centuries ago when the new city had been first enclosed. Now it had been converted to a manufactory for making the cheap hard candy Eluzbois' lower classes loved. A huge circular vat filled one end of the floor, 4 stories below. Others of smaller size were grouped down the walls, 2 sets of 3 separated by a raised plank walk. The interior had been gutted, save for structural timbers bracing the concrete block walls, and a few for cranes and hoists. At their feet lay a sparse network of such rafters. A ladder led down to the 2nd floor, where there was a skeletal tracing around the central opening, and a decked timber floor along one wall where a hoist door stood open beside a swing-out crane. 3 adder fangs turned from the platform. "I'll take the ladder," Shkyra said. Her quiver was empty, and that was her only distance weapon. Megan nodded and headed purposefully toward a dangling pulley and hook arrangement that swung out over the center of the building's interior. The ladder was simply an upright timber that had cross pieces pegged on, leading down to a foot-wide horizontal beam. Shkyra took the inside, putting the wood between her and the adder fangs, and made speed by dropping straight down with an occasional grab to slow herself. It was only twice man-height, and she wanted to have sound footing on that beam before the black coat was within striking distance. After that, she did not await much trouble. The assassin would be more at home fighting where 1 step to the side would end 15 meters down on flagstones, but Long Knife, against a command's cavalry saber, was no contest. The assassin had the same thought. As he ran cat-certain along the narrow beams toward the ladder, he unlimbered a weapon quite unlike a knife. It was a chain, 2 meters in length. The last half of the links had outer edges honed to a razor edge, and the tip ended in a ball of spikes. A fighting iron, and deadly, if well used. The end curled around the ladder and came within a hairbreadth of taking the commander's face with it when it withdrew. Shkyra saved herself with an astonishing sideways leap onto the horizontal beam. She landed off balance and beat a shuffling retreat to keep the whistling length of metal out of reach. The figure in black handled the strange killing tool like a master, keeping it whirling in a great fan of figure-8s that put moving metal between every inch of his body and Shkyra's long, curved sword. She backed, feet groping for balance, right foot forward, poised to lunge. This was like the standard foot fighting without shield stance, using the menace of the point to substitute for a defensive weapon, but the need to remember the gap on both sides of her was a continual nagging distraction, and the chain was the natural enemy of the sword. It could be thrown hard against the edge and used to drag the blade wielder off balance. Once balance was gone, half the fight was lost, and this thing could curve right around a parry and cripple you. On flat ground, or in armor, or with a shield, she would have felt confident enough. As it was, no shadow of doubt showed in face or stance or poise. Her mouth was slightly open, breath even, eyes slitted and wary. The blade poised, then flashed out at the vulnerable spot where the hands whirled the chain. He jerked back, but used the same motion to pivot the swing of the fighting iron down toward her feet. It would slice them open above the boots, or wrap around her ankles and throw her off. She leaped straight up and cut, but there was no force behind it when a good landing was so crucial, nor time to draw the slash. A line of red opened on his upper arm. The eyes behind the hood widened slightly. She gave ground, feet still moving in a fast, light shuffle. He followed and raised the chain at an angle. The death circle of his swing now centered at eye level, angling out toward her. Megan had run along the beam to the spot opposite the loading doors. Her position was too exposed and vulnerable for wisdom, but she hoped that the sheer outrageousness of that would throw them off. Apparently, it did. She dodged a shuriken as if it were a thrown knife in a nifta game and reached the center of the beam. The sheave pulley was locked at the top by a friction block, rope coiled on the wood and dangling down. She seized the coil and looked to see one assassin heading for another ladder. The other watched them all coolly and directed. Megan's hand had gathered the right amount of rope, she hoped. She leapt straight back, allowing the beam itself to pull her onto the correct arc to knock the one straight out the doors or crush her against the crane. Neither worked. As she swung, the younger assassin spun around and brought up a blowgun, while the other leapt out of her way. She was just too close to change direction and arched past. As she missed, she felt the jar as a dart sprouted in the rope by her arm. Her other hand swept around with the trailing end of the rope. The hook on the end of it took the young Adderfang under the chin. Her weight dragged him across the floor to fall toward the vats below, but the snapping of his neck prevented the jawbone from tearing out entirely. The body hung somewhere between the second and third floors, twitching spasmodically as nerves died in the already dead body. Megan landed in a roll on the landing bay platform and came to her feet, knife in hand, to confront the leader of this group. She stared into eyes gone black with hate and thought, "Of course, I've killed her guildkin, as I will kill her." Her boots grated on the dust and grit that had collected. It smelled of ragweed and dust, drowning in burned sugar. It was furnace hot up under the roof, and she could feel the sweat prickling on her lip and running down her face as she watched the assassin before her. Let her think it's fear sweat. Above the mask, dark eyes glinted. To the side, she heard the struggle between Shkyra and her opponent, harsh gusts of breath and the scuff of leather on wood, but she couldn't shift attention from the death that threatened. Here, with feet of space echoing below, the speed and quickness that could compensate for the other's reach would be nearly useless. An outsider would have seen nothing fearful in the figures of the two women facing one another save the knives gleaming in their hands. The only moves they made at first were slight shiftings of the feet and hands. Eyes locked on her opponent's, Megan raised her dagger a fraction of an inch, playing through the possible sequence that would end with the knife buried in the adder's guts, and found it instantly countered. Play and counterplay, every move, even to the constriction of eyes, vital to the death of the other. Not showy, but the one who failed first would die. Testing, Megan twitched the hand farthest away from the other, another knife suddenly peering in it to spin toward her opponent. The adder leaned aside and countered, her blade tearing the cloth over Megan's thigh as she retreated. All of 10 seconds had passed, feint and counter. Both were breathing hard. The hollow sound of the thin floor warned Megan that she couldn't retreat much more. The edge was too near, just a few feet behind her. The Adderfang allowed herself to be distracted for a fraction of a second by the clang of steel on the beams across the building. That was enough. As her eyes flickered back to Megan, the Zac feinted again. The Adder lunged to counter and committed herself. A flurry of movement, and the assassin sprang back out of range. A tearing sound had marked contact, and the cloth of the assassin's hood gaped open at throat height, though Megan's blade still showed clean. Dog sucker, Megan thought. That one should have done it. This one is as fast as I am. A trick is what I need, and a good one. Again the game had begun, the Fahinin determined not to be taken in a second time. The edge was a body length behind Megan, and she could hear the thick plopping sounds below as the sugar boiled. Her idea was dangerous. She began to drop her guard, as though tiring. She allowed her eyes to shift and made her breathing harsh. She licked her lips and began to edge back, showing classic signs of fear and tiredness. Her counters to the other's moves slowed, and she let fear show on her features. Behind the mask of her face, she watched the assassin accept the messages she was sending. When the adder was sure enough to begin forcing her toward the edge, she backed and flung the dagger at the assassin as if her nerve had broken. As her hand shifted to the throwing position, the other lunged and came in for the kill. Megan fell back, trying to avoid the knife, but taking it in the shoulder rather than the throat. She locked crossed hands around the assassin's arm, then rolled. The adderfang was moving forward already, couldn't stop, and she flew over Megan's head, assisted by a boot in the belly. Shock just had time to dawn in her eyes, changing to panic, as she realized that she was not going to land on this level. Megan followed through, feeling the edge of the floor hit her at chest height. She threw herself forward and hung, held by the leverage of her outstretched arms and her claws dug into the wood, the grating shock of the knife in the bones of her shoulder graying the room out. The assassin fell, spiraling down, reaching to catch something, anything. She landed in the main vat, the force of her fall driving her under. She flailed to the surface, screaming horribly as the boiling sugar pulled her down again. She thrashed as if to climb the air, flesh already loosening from the heat. A last clenching of a gray cooked hand and she was gone. Megan swung one leg up onto the edge and lay there a moment on her belly, panting. She watched a drop of her blood follow the adderfang, then her head snapped up to Shkyra's fight.